Hey, alrighty. So, in the last lecture, I made a big deal out of nature, the dominance of nature, and behaviorism as a reaction to that, and it was in part. It was also a reaction to a number of other things, and in a way, behaviorism begun even before it formally began. Wow, is that a complicated thing? So I'm going to walk you through that a little bit. But the other thing, the other issue that really fueled behaviorism was the battle that psychology had been sort of waging since its conception, since its inception, about being a science and how to be a science well. And remember, I highlighted that early on too, and I said how like the psychophysicists had been able to show nice functions that followed mathematical relationships, and that really helped psychology have enough respectability to begin in the first place. But then, as we hit Wundt early on, who's trying to do things very, very scientifically, but he seems to need introspection. That notion of introspection to really because he wants to know about what consciousness is like, and so he needs people to tell him what they're experiencing, and that becomes a problem. Introspection itself becomes controversial. Is it very scientific or not? So there's a little bit of that going on, and then Freud came along and just sort of blew everything up with clinical psychology that wasn't scientific at all, and wasn't even trying to be scientific, but in many people's minds, that was what psychology was all about. And at some point around then, there was this other Russian physiologist. Let's go to him, named Ivan Pavlov. He did not consider himself a psychologist. He was a physiologist studying digestive processes, at least initially. But he ended up, his story is really interesting. He ended up seeing that his original research idea wasn't as cool as something he was actually witnessing, and he changed on the fly how his research, what his research was all about, to be quite honest with you. And in so doing, he really created a model of how you might be able to get some really good data, very scientific data related to something that's very important to psychology. And that something is learning. This has been a philosophical issue. Remember, we talked about the tabula rasa and all that. A really interesting issue of how do we learn when we interact with things in the world. Now, this is very much a nurture thing, right? Connecting to the previous thing. It's about our interactions with the world and how our interactions with the world change us and how we eventually perhaps learn to function effectively in the world. So that issue of learning, how do we learn? That's a very psychological issue. And yet Pavlov kind of ended up coming at it in a very different way than anybody had in the past. And again, it became almost a model that Watson and the others kind of grabbed onto and brought into psychology and kind of brought Pavlov with them. Okay, so let's talk about Pavlov's journey. So, okay. Wow, I'm starting here already, and I'm not giving you the story of Pavlov. I'm going to come back to this, and I'm going to give you a little bit of the story of Well, okay, I have the story of Pavlov here. I don't have the real story of Pavlov here, though. Okay, I'm going to go back all the way here to and I'm going to start with the story of Pavlov, and then we'll kind of get through this, and we'll build up this stuff. So, Pavlov, excuse me, was, as I said, a physiologist. He was interested in digestion, and specifically, he was interested in how different kinds of foods maybe kicked off the digestive process in different ways. And so, you see this, right? We put foods in our mouths, digestive processes are initiated. Remember I told you that when we're born, we have all of these reflexes that are kind of built in. And one of those reflexes is the digestive reflex. When food is put in our mouth, the digestive reflex kicks off. But again, Pavlov wanted to know, is all food created equal? And so what he did is the following. If you want to know if the digestive process is happening, One way to know that is by measuring how much saliva is in an organism's mouth. When the digestive process kicks off, one of the first things it does is fill your mouth with saliva. And the saliva, of course, helps you break down the food when you chew it, soften it, and it allows the rest of the body to digest it effectively. Pretty cool, huh? Our whole system, how all these things work. And so what Pavlov had was a bunch of dogs, and he had a little tube that went right under their jaw and literally into their mouth. And as they drooled, basically, the drool would go down this tube and it could be measured. So you could actually measure how much the dog was drooling. And Pavlov's original plan was to measure that response in relation to different kinds of foods to see if you got more drooling of one thing and then another. Okay, so let me stop that. I'm going to try to tell the Pavlov story as we interact between these slides. So where is he starting? Okay, he is starting with what we're going to call this UCS-UCR relationship. So there's going to be a few terms in this chapter that are brand new if you've never taken psychology before, and they're going to be a little hard to negotiate, and I'm going to try my best to help you with this. So first of all, you're going to see the word conditioned a lot. And when we use the word conditioned, we don't mean like a hair conditioner or anything like that. What we mean, it's an alternate word for learning. When you condition somebody, you're teaching them something. They're learning something as they go through a conditioning process. And so you can better think of this word as learned, unlearned, and learned responses. However, there's another trick to this that you'll already see. We end up talking about individual things like the unlearned stimulus and the unlearned response, or the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response, as though they were separate things. But in reality, I want you to think of these as two members of a pair. Think of them like the words husband and wife. You know, when we say, oh, that person's the husband, that implies that somewhere else there is a wife. You know, and that somebody might be right there with them, but a husband does not exist on its own as a husband. A husband only exists when that wife exists that goes with him. And similarly, a wife exists when there's a husband that goes with her. So similarly, when we talk about an unconditioned stimulus, that's one member of a pair. So it's really the pair we're talking about. It's an unconditioned relative to this response. Okay. Slowly building. So what we've said here is there are a number of situations, there are instincts that we have where a certain stimulus automatically produces a certain response. And we never had to learn to do this. It just is part of our hardwired, our hard coding. We call these instincts, right? You're born with these instincts. I mentioned this one before you when I was talking about these instincts. If a projectile is coming at your face, you close your eyes, you duck your head, you raise your hands, sometimes hold your breath. That's just something we all do. And we do it from, a very young, I don't condone this, but if you throw a Nerf ball at the face of a baby, you will see it close its eyes and pull away. And if it cries, it's your problem to deal with. I didn't suggest you do that. I'm just saying if you did, that's what you would see. But there's a bunch of other things. So I mentioned foods kicks off the digestive process. A creepy noise or some potential danger automatically kicks in our sympathetic nervous system. Remember that fight or flee. And so we come preloaded with a bunch of these things. And when we start with this pair, we're going to call it an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. And again, those terms always refer to these two things. This stimulus mixed with this response is unconditioned. And what we mean by that is you did not have to learn this relationship. It's not learned, unlearned, unconditioned. It's something that was already there. We're going to compare this with conditioned stimuli and conditioned responses where we learn to link a certain stimulus with a certain response. These ones we didn't have to learn. They were there from birth. That's where things kind of start. So for Pavlov, he was interested in this response. Put food in the mouth, the digestive process kicks off, which you can measure through the amount of saliva in a dog's mouth. Okay, cool. Now, if we just start there for a moment, we're going to talk about some of the things that can happen when we start with an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. So one of the things that can happen is called habituation. If a stimulus occurs repeatedly without any positive or negative, or negative consequence, the startle response stops occurring. So here's an example, and I used to see this. I think it was Dave Letterman or something, and I don't know if you guys know Betty White. She was this funny. She passed away just recently. A funny comedian who was hilarious. And anyway, she was going until her 90s or 95, still doing comedy, still doing stuff. One of the things she would do is go on David Letterman, and they would have her go behind this plexiglass, and she'd have to put her face right to it, and they would like fire out of a cannon things like pies and stuff that would splat right in front of her, and her job was to not blink, was to sit there with her eyes open. Okay, and you can get pretty good at this as long as you're behind that plexiglass, right? If trial after trial they shoot something but it doesn't actually hit you, and so there's no negative consequence, then after a while, you can get good at controlling what would normally be a natural response. And in fact, you can just stop responding to it at all. And this will happen pretty naturally. If it doesn't cause any negative impact on you, then even though it initially caused you to do something, eventually you just stop responding to it. So here's some examples that you may have known of. The weird house noises you no longer hear. So when you first go into some new house, you hear certain weird creaks that automatically kick in your sympathetic nervous system and keep you awake at night. Oh, I don't know what's out there. But night after night, hearing those creaks over and over, slowly they stop triggering that response. So the creaks are still there, but eventually you don't even wake up. You don't even notice that they're there at all. And they certainly don't make you nervous anymore. Okay, so you habituate to those sounds, which means you just stop responding to them. You almost stop noticing them. I mentioned here airplanes at my old place. I used to live at a place where airplanes flew over. Very loud. But I lived there for years. I got to hardly even noticing them, even though they're crazy loud. In fact, I would often be talking on the phone to somebody, and I didn't even notice I would do this, but when a plane goes over, I would stop talking. I would just stop talking because I knew I couldn't hear anything. But I didn't consciously stop talking. It was just a habit controlled by my limbic system that I started to do. When my limbic system heard an airplane coming, it would just stop me for talking. I would just wait for a moment. And then the airplane would go over and I would be ready to resume the conversation. Depending on which friend it was, if it was a friend who did not talk to me often, they would often say, "My goodness, what the heck just happened there? I heard this loud noise." And I'd be like, "I don't know. Oh, maybe a plane went over. Did a plane go? Does it sound like a plane went over? Because it might have went over. I don't know. I don't even notice them anymore." Okay, but the person on the other side might notice it. Now, if the person on the other side had talked to me a lot on the phone, they might also just pause when the airplane goes over, and then we might resume our conversation as if nothing happened, because for the both of us, nothing happened. Neither one of us sort of ever heard that anymore. We'd habituated to it. One last example, because you've run into it before, and I like to tie all these things together. Remember, we were talking about the mirrors and animals' reaction to the mirrors, and I mentioned that a number of animals, including dogs, when they first see the reflection, or if they see it in a surprise, when they don't expect it, they will often bark and stuff like they would to another dog. But after a while, they just stop reacting to the mirror altogether. Like I say, it's hard for me to even get my dog to look at her reflection in a mirror. If I lift her up to a mirror, she's kind of like, not impressed, doesn't want to look at it at all. It's like it's just nothing interesting. And that's what happens. So they realize, hey, there's a reflection of a dog there. There's something that looks like a dog. It don't smell like a dog. It never bites me. It never plays with me. It doesn't do anything. So then it just stops paying attention to it. It habituates to it, and it's like that thing goes away. Okay, so this is the first thing that can happen with a UCR UCS. So even though we're born with this connection in place, that certain stimuli give rise to certain responses, if that stimulus keeps coming up and the response that we have isn't appropriate, If that little creak, the creaks of the heating and whatever, they make you all nervous, but then nothing happens. And if that happens over and over again, that your response is inappropriate, your system will stop responding that way. It will habituate. And so even though that link was there, right from birth, in this context, it stops triggering. Noises stop triggering the scary reaction when you're in your home context that you know well. Okay. This is learning, by the way. Let's be clear about this. This is your system learning that its natural response isn't appropriate. And so it stops producing that natural response in that context, right? Okay. That's habituation. All right. Now let's get to Pavlov. So I say he stumbled across an interesting phenomenon because he did stumble across it. And he's so clever for doing what he did. So here's what he found. And here's the critical point. Day one, everything worked fine. They had research assistants. They had a number of different kinds of food. And they came to the lab. They opened the food, etc. Dog was just standing there. And then when they put food in the dog's mouth, it began to drool. Okay, everything was fine. However, when they repeated the experiment day after day, something weird started happening. The dog started drooling before the food was placed in its mouth. Okay, as soon as that person got in there and started working with the food, and any of you guys who have dogs know this, as soon as you start preparing their food, the dog is essentially starting to prepare to eat. It's like it has learned, oh, there's some stimuli in the environment that predicts I'm about to have food in my mouth. And it starts drooling. Okay, so imagine yourself Pavlov. There's two ways you can react to this. One is like, oh my goodness, how am I supposed to do my experiment now? That experiment I had in mind, the assumption was the animal wouldn't drool until I put the food in his mouth, and then he would drool, so I would know it was the food that caused the reaction. But if he's already drooling before I even put the food in his mouth, my goodness, my experiment is ruined. So you could go running out there with your head in your hand saying, I don't know how to do my experiment. Or you could do what Pavlov did. You could go, that's interesting. The animal is learning that food is coming. In fact, that's more interesting than my original study was planning, that it was all about. It was about different drool to different kinds of food. This one is more interesting. The dog has learned that food is coming. Maybe I should study that. And so he did something we nowadays would call a pivot. And it's something I think I think we do a bad job teaching you guys the value of pivoting, the value of failure. In a sense, Pavlov's experiment failed the moment those dogs started drooling ahead of time. But anytime something fails, it often means, okay, the current tact you're on is not working the way you want, but maybe there's something else cool. Maybe if you think about the failure in depth, it will highlight a different path that could be even more interesting than your first path. So you can pivot to that new path. New, like startup companies, entrepreneurial entities, they believe in embracing failure. They believe, hey, you don't know the best way to sell something? What do? Try something. Try to sell it. And when it fails, and it probably will, learn from that failure and see if there's a better way. Does the failure suggest a better way? And so then you pivot to that better way and you try it. And if it fails, you pivot to a better way. And you don't get all emotionally wrapped up in the failures. You use them to help you, find the best path. And that's what Pavlov did. And that's what you should all do as well, by the way. I've failed many times and I'm a pretty good pivoter. And so, I think that's a good skill to have. Okay. So Pavlov pivoted and he said, okay, hey, what is going on here? These animals are learning, and they're learning a new relationship, right? It was one thing to say food makes them drool, but what's making them drool now? It's not something that would naturally make somebody drool. Like, for example, it could be the dude with a white lab coat bringing the food to the counter, or it could be maybe the sound of the can opener or something like that is suddenly making the dog drool. That's not natural. They had to have learned to do that. How did they learn to do that? So that's what he pivoted towards. That was the question, and he discovered a phenomenon come to be called classical conditioning. And the cool thing about it is it describes how new stimuli can be associated or can become associated with new responses. So it's like we're born with a set of stimulus response things that are sort of hardwired, but as we go through life, we can add to these. We can create new stimulus response associations. And he's going to describe a process that makes that happen. So anyway, Pavlov is now known as one of the most influential figures in psychology, certainly, and his experiments started this wave of behaviorism. It started the wave of behaviorism because, as I described to you what he did, notice how structured the procedure is, how scientific it is, for lack of a better term, but notice also how well we can measure everything of relevance. We're not going to rely on subjective stuff. We're not going to ask the dog how he feels. We are just going to look at how the dog behaves in certain contexts. And we can measure the attributes of those contexts, and we can measure the behavior very precisely. And that's what was so attractive to people who came after. So let's walk you through classical conditioning. So yes, here is the pivot. Here is now Pavlov being the Pavlov we know him today, not the physiologist ahead of time. And here's the procedure he came up with. So it has a number of steps. So in the first step, what you start is you start with what we would call a neutral stimulus. And what we mean by that is when it comes to the behavior of interest, and in this case it's going to be digestion as measured by saliva, how strong the digestive process kicks off. So if you're interested in that, we're going to start with a stimulus that should have nothing to do with that. And so the stimulus we have here is a bell. We ring a bell, ding, 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 ding. And does the dog drool? Why would the dog drool? Because you rang a bell, right? No, it does not drool. You can tell there's no drool. And you're like, what are you talking about? You'll see in subsequent slides. But right now the dog is maybe curious. Maybe his ears perk up. That would be a natural reaction. Maybe his eyes go over to it, attention being pulled to the bell. Those are all natural reactions. So he might do those things, but he's not going to drool. Okay. Until we do some conditioning trials. So here's before the conditioning trials, let me just do this other reality. So we've already talked about this, but just to be clear, if, however, we give him food, if we present food to the dog, then, look at this. Nice, good drool happening here. Now, this is the unconditioned stimulus of food producing the unconditioned response of salivation. Again, always think of these things as a pair. And a UCS goes with a UCR, and a CS goes with a CR. Okay. And so in this case, it's food producing salivation, and that happens naturally. We didn't have to condition it. It just was there. So that's why it's unconditioned. Stimulus gives this unconditioned response. Okay. So now we start to condition the learning trials. Okay. This is what happens, and it happens over and over and over and over and over. Okay. We need lots of these trials, but here's what we do. We first ring a bell. Then we give the dog food. And of course, the dog's salivating, right? Because he's getting food. And he always salivates. Now, I want you to actually sort of notice how much salivation, how big these drops are and how big the pool is. That's going to be important. This is the natural salivation response. In fact, I'm going to go back a slide, back to the baseline. And this is the natural. So it's lots of saliva anytime he has food in his mouth. So even on these conditional trials, we ring a bell, give him food, he drools a lot. Lots of saliva. A little while goes by, then we ring a bell again, give him food, he drools a lot. A little bit of time goes by, we ring a bell again, give him food, he drools a lot. Do this over and over and over again, okay? Now, at some point, we do the critical trial. And the critical trial, you notice this is going to be called a CS. Yeah, I'll come back to that, okay? The critical trial is this one. So on this trial, we ring the bell, but we don't give him food. However, what we will notice is that he's drooling. Now, he's not drooling as much. Let me go back. See how much he was drooling when it was a UCR? Now he's drooling just in response to the bell. But he is drooling in response to the bell. Remember back at the beginning? Let's go back to the beginning. Here's the beginning. In the beginning, he did not drool when the bell rang. He drooled when you put food in his mouth, but not when the bell rang. Unless you did bell, food, bell, food, bell, food. What's happening here? The bell is starting to predict that food is coming, right? This is what the dog is learning, is that when that bell rings, food comes right after it. And it drools a lot once it gets the food. But now, if we get nasty on him, we ring the bell, we're not giving them the food, but he starts to drool anyway, okay, even without the food. He has learned to drool to the bell. So now this is a proper CSCR. So CS, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. It's conditioned. He's learned to do this response to that stimulus. Remember, always a pair, husband and wife, right? So he has learned that the bell predicts food, and he started to drool to the bell. So this is Pavlov formalizing what the problem, right? The problem was he noticed his animals were drooling ahead of time. And so he came up with this process that I just described as a way of showing how that learning happens, that it happens through prediction, through having the CS precede a UCS. So I'm gonna give you this jargon now, and you almost want to rewind back this sentence I'm about to say a few times. When it makes sense to you, you're getting somewhere with this, okay? So what we want to do is we want to reliably follow the conditioned stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus will, of course, produce an unconditioned response. So if we reliably precede the unconditioned stimulus with the conditioned stimulus starts to predict the occurrence of the unconditioned stimulus. And then what happens is, even when you don't present the unconditioned stimulus, you get the conditioned response. So the animal starts to drool to the bell. Now, I've made a big deal out of this being smaller drool. You know, some people say, well, why is this a CR? I thought you said drooling was a UCR. It is with respect to food, but it's also different with respect to food. When the animal drools to food, they drool a lot. So that's what the UCR is, the full-blown reaction. When they drool after conditioning to the bell, they drool a little bit. So it's the same sort of behavior, but it tends to be different in magnitude. It tends to be less extreme. Okay, so we're getting that same kind of behavior in a way, just less extreme. Okay, so what is going on at this point? Well, the animal has learned a new association. It has learned that the bell may predict food, and it is starting to respond to the bell the way it responds to food. Okay, drooling. It's learned this association. Classical conditioning, we call it. There are some examples from The Office and other things of classical conditioning that I will put in the Top Hat textbook for you to take a look at and help you think about this a little bit more. But this is the basic process. So let's see where we go from here. This is the sort of overview of everything we've been talking about. So the brain is constantly using past experience to make predictions about future events. It likes to know what's going to come before it comes. And so it's preparing the body for those events. It wants to be ready for what's about to happen. So if we want to produce this sort of classical conditioning, first of all, the UCS must reliably follow the CS. You want to get to a point where you can unpack these, right? The unconditioned stimulus must reliably follow the conditioned stimulus. A better way to say that, in fact, I'm tempted to change it right now, is that the conditioned stimulus must reliably predict the occurrence of the UCS, right? Because it's always the conditioned stimulus first and then the UCS. And so the bell and then the food. And so we're trying to create a situation where the bell is predicting that food is about to come. And in order for that to work, we have to do exactly that. The food has to follow the bell. and it has to do so reliably. And if it does, the brain starts to pick up on that regularity, okay? If the association is not strong enough, the learning will be weak. So it depends on, how reliable is this pairing, is this following, okay? Okay, and so let's just, before we get to these two, and so if you do it reliably, if you follow the CS with a UCS, then the animal will begin to respond to the CS in a way similar to how it responds to the UCS, i.e. the UCR, but not as strong. And so we call that the CR, the conditioned response. Again, I'm just trying to work your mind to see if you can decode these sorts of sentences. Okay, cool. So now here's a couple of other things to mention about classical conditioning that we've learned in follow-up experiments. Let's say you do this for a while and you have the dog drooling, and now you what's called terminate the connection, the association between the CS and the UCS. So what we mean by this is you start doing the following. You ring the bell, but then you don't give any food. And you ring the bell and you don't give any food. You ring the bell, you don't give any food. So now the bell is no longer predicting food. This is after the animal had learned, right? They had learned that behavior, but now you're just stiffing them. You're giving them the bell, but you're not giving them the food. And so after a while, the animal starts not responding to the bell anymore. So it stops that drooling that it learned. Okay. And so the CR eventually will not occur in response to the CS, and we call this extinction. So it's like the animal has learned, well, okay, it used to be that a bell told me food was coming, but seems like that's not happening anymore. So bell rings, big deal. I'm not going to drool. However, the animal has not forgotten. And we know this because sometimes once you've done the above, once they've learned a response and then you put them through extinction, if you sometimes just have one instance of the bell followed by food, then immediately the animal goes back to responding to the bell, drooling to the bell. It can take just one trial to bring back that learning. So it's like the learning is still there, but it's been put in sort of hibernation. Okay, bell's not giving me any food anymore, fine. But then bell food, oh, it is. It's back. And we see the animal now start to go right back to that drooling to the bell, and we call that spontaneous recovery. That doesn't sound all that interesting with respect to food and bells and drooling, but what you'll see is that a lot of the things we've learned in the behaviorist days, we now use in some of our best therapeutic techniques. And one of those therapeutic techniques involves extinction. So for example, let's say that you're scared of elevators. And, you keep thinking every time I go in an elevator, something bad will happen because, maybe it did once or twice and it produced that learning in you. One of the nasty things somebody might do to you is say, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to ride a bunch of elevators. We're going to ride them over and over and over, and they're going to try to do extinction to you, right? We're going to get on the elevator, press a button, we'll go to the floor, nothing bad happened. See? And we'll do it again, nothing bad happened. Nothing bad happened, over and over and over again. And so the idea is once you convince them that stepping onto an elevator does not predict something bad, then they can get over it. They can start to feel like, okay, I can get on an elevator. I don't feel that anxiety anymore. Whew, better. I mean, it took a lot of learning, took a lot of effort, but we extinguished that response to elevators. But the problem is, if that person gets on an elevator and just once that elevator screws up, does a nasty clunk, gets stuck between floors, something happens that's scary in that elevator, boom, therapy's over. All the work you did getting that person to a good spot could be over, and they can immediately have spontaneous recovery, which means they're right back to that fear reaction. Okay, so spontaneous recovery can be a problem when this stuff is used therapeutically. Okay, so really what I want you to get from this, you'll read about classical conditioning. I'll show you a couple of other fun sort of examples, and by the end of that, you'll have it. You'll say, okay, this is cool. I understand classical conditioning. And then we're going to tell you about something called operant conditioning. And it'll be easy. It'll make sense. But now suddenly you'll be confused. What's the difference between classical and operant? How do I think about these two differently? And those two things will become confused in your mind. So I want to stress something before we go any further. Think of classical conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning it's sometimes called, as learning by association. You are learning that something predicts something else, that thing one predicts thing two. And if you have a natural reaction to thing two, let's call it response two, then eventually you'll start showing that reaction to thing one, because thing one predicts thing two. You respond a certain way to thing two, you'll start to respond that way to thing one. It's all about association. Thing one and thing two have hung out so much together, you start to respond to them similarly. Okay, so it's learning by association. When we talk about operant conditioning, it'll be learning by consequence. And I hope that distinction will help you, like when you're on an exam or something like that, figure out which situation you're in a given situation. Okay, cool. Let's leave it there with the Pavlovian conditioning. Again, immediately watch some of those other examples that I've posted from YouTube. Just a couple of things that are funny and that can, just really make sure you got the sense of it.